what is the beginning of our 2.5-day gathering Divergence. We do this twice a year. And this year, our theme, or this time in December, our theme is Art in the Time of Healing, the Importance of IBPOC Arts to Planetary Renewal. We chose this theme because of the number of things that have come up during the past couple of years that COVID has accentuated. And that is the historical inequities that artists of color, Indigenous artists, other marginalized artists face, and how COVID has shown an incredibly bright light, a blistering light on that inequity. Many artists that I know are worried about their future, worried about whether or not they will be able to return to performance spaces or to other ways in which they create work, or will they be able to continue their careers as artists. And so this 2.5 days is to address those kinds of questions from various panels, artistic showcases, and so on. However, before beginning, it is important to acknowledge the space in which we are presenting this. And not only do I present a land acknowledgement, which recognizes that we are in Taikaranto. This is Land of Treaty 13, the home of the Mississauga, of the Credit, of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Chippewa, and many others who have come through this territory and who have lived in this land under the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon. It is also an honor for us to be here in Aki Studios, the home of Native Earth Performing Arts. I cannot think of a better way to address this gathering Divergence of the next 2.5 days than to be in the home of an Indigenous organization. So that's what I wanted to bring just by way of greeting, and then to introduce the panel to you, which will be led by Shannon Litzenberger, who will introduce the panelists. So again, I'm sure you're going to enjoy this one. Hang on.
Thank you so much, Charles. Welcome to State of Emergence, Why We Need Artists Right Now. My name is Shannon Litzenberger, and I will be your host and moderator for this session. And I am joined by an extraordinary group of artists who I will introduce to you in just a little bit. But for now, I'll just introduce myself. I'm a dance artist, choreographer, director, embodiment facilitator, and also a program associate with SAPAMO. Since the pandemic hit, I've been thinking quite a lot about the state of the arts, as I'm sure many of you have as well, but more specifically, the state of artists. I've put some of that reflection into writing in the form of an essay that I'm quite excited to share with you now. It's been very much a labor of love, in hopes that my perspective as an artist on the current crisis might feel resonant for others of you artists out there whose experiences need to be made visible in this time of great disruption. So the essay consists of 4 parts. The first, the alienated state of the artist, an emergency and a revolution in the making. The second, from culture as a colonial project to culture as a lever for change. Third, artists as world makers. And fourth, from emergency to emergence, detaching from the current system to build the next one. So these fellow artists have already had the opportunity to reflect on the themes of the essay. They've read an advanced copy. And so we'll hear some of those reflections and more about their experiences during the second half of the session. And there will also be an engagement for some questions from the audience live and online. So thank you so much for being here. Let's just dive in. Introduction. One artist's perspective on the current crisis. The neon sign erected by the pandemic reads, "Change or perish." If we take the imperative of social transformation seriously, then we understand that we are living in a time between worlds. The arts was devastated by the pandemic, and we are facing a moment of reckoning where we need to examine the ways that we organize our systems of cultural production. This is not just about updating the policies and redistributing resources, but also about the culture we embody in our field. Recalibration of the former will have limited impact without the latter. We must disrupt the behaviors and practices that perpetuate the system as it was designed. As restrictions are lifted and we are allowed once again to stage our plays, mount our choreographies, host our galas, and open our exhibitions, how will we avoid sliding back into the habits of a world we know is oppressive, inequitable, and unsustainable? As a community of culture makers, how do we work at the level of culture change as a priority in order to fully embody the world we aspire to? These questions have been at the center of my pandemic-inspired reflections. As a practicing dance artist, embodiment facilitator, change maker, policy thinker, and longtime arts advocate, I'm invested in the role artists have to play in this moment of reemergence and social transformation. I believe that artists are world makers and that this work is critical right now. I also believe that artists are not adequately centered or supported in the professional arts ecosystem, nor have they been ambitiously mobilized as change agents during this time of crisis, much to the detriment of the arts and to society at large. My response to this dilemma is a call for radical experimentation, both to artists and to those who make decisions about the systems that organize our work. Part 1. The alienated state of the artist, an emergency and a revolution in the making. The role of the artist is that of the soldier of the revolution, Diego Rivera. The experience we are living through is simultaneously an emergency and a revolution in the making. While these phenomena often go hand in hand, they create a contradiction in the way we as individuals and as a society might respond. In an emergency, our nature is to stabilize, to mitigate damage, to prioritize survival. And in a revolution, we mobilize, we disrupt, and we set fire to the establishment. So while governments, businesses, and many public service organizations continue to lead emergency response strategies, many artists are at the center of the activism and community organizing that is fueling a revolution. So here we find ourselves in a moment of paradox, where the systems are trying to preserve themselves, while artists are joining a mounting resistance. It may seem contradictory, but there is a reason that emergency and emergence share an etymological root. The Latin root of the word means to rise, to bring to light. What if this paradox is exactly the alchemy that could bring about the social transformation we so desperately need? What would it mean for a society to ambitiously mobilize artists to do their work well and fully with the aim of catalyzing transformative change? Well, first, we might start by expanding our view beyond the notion that artists are creative unicorns here to entertain, distract, and comfort us, as popular media has suggested throughout the pandemic. While comfort, distraction, and entertainment have been the emotional crutches of too many months in lockdown, the work of artists is much more fundamental in this moment. The role of the artist in a time of transition is, most essentially, one of catalyzing emergence. Art-making processes are essential right now because we are in a moment where an old world is collapsing and a new world has yet to emerge. We need people who are practiced in the art of working collaboratively and across differences in highly volatile conditions, able to venture into the unknown with the aim of creation. Cycles of history tell us that artists have always been at the forefront in moments of social transformation. In her book, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency, author Olivia Lang wrote that art shapes our ethical landscapes. It opens us to the interior lives of others. It is a training ground for possibility. It makes plain inequalities and it offers other ways of living. Art is a process of transformation concerned with collective human development. Art thrives in the what-if questions and relishes the learning of each experiment. Art is both a barometer and a process of social transformation. As we consider the potential role of artists as change agents, as healers, as animators of the public imagination, as world makers, Can we first turn our gaze toward the experience of artists inside this moment of great disruption? How are artists doing right now? Are they thriving? Are they being ambitiously mobilized to do their most essential work? The pandemic has been devastating for the arts, though it has been particularly ruinous for artists. Through the pandemic, emergency response strategies in the arts have deployed ample resources to institutions and organizations to ensure their survival. But what about the survival of artists? Here's a snapshot of artists during the pandemic. 62% reported high levels of stress or total burnout. Artists lost an average of 36 opportunities, amounting to over $25,000 of income. 63% of all cultural workers access CERB, and for many artists I know, this was a more stable and significant income than in pre-pandemic times. Even before the pandemic, artists were so poorly compensated that pursuing a career in the arts hasn't been viable or sustainable without significant financial subsidization for some time. Artists are the worst compensated workers in our field, and artists are regularly exploited economically to help keep the engine of the arts and culture sector running. In 2016, the median income of artists was 44% lower than the median income of all Canadian workers, while cultural workers in general have median incomes much closer to the Canadian norm at 6% lower than all workers. Here in Toronto, 69% of artists make less than Toronto's living wage of $45,000 per year, and half make less than $30,000, according to Toronto Arts Stats 2019. 72% of us work on a freelance or contract basis and have incomes from multiple arts-related sources. To make ends meet, we also have additional part or full-time jobs within and in growing numbers outside the arts. We are overworked and we no longer believe we can survive here, and so we are leaving the city. The need to work in proximity to robust arts markets in community with fellow arts professionals is, for too many, outweighed by a need to survive, to pay rent, to buy groceries. Anecdotally, we know that artists are also leaving the field altogether. In his new book, The Death of the Artist, essayist and critic William Dershowitz deftly describes several evolving market conditions that have adversely impacted artists in North American society. First, thanks to monopolizing tech companies, vast amounts of profits have been redirected away from creators to distributors, i.e. them, leaving artists chronically underpaid for their work, even at considerable scale. More nefariously, art in the digital age has been steadily demonetized, expected for free or at shockingly low cost. How do we reconcile this expectation with the call to ramp up the creation and dissemination of digital content? Second, artists work for free behind the scenes so they can access the limited and mostly underpaid opportunities offered to them in the arts marketplace. Artists know they must appeal to the gatekeepers of the art world capable of making them stand out. Funders, presenters, curators, and programmers all deploy resources like space, money, access to audiences in support of the artist's work. Gaining access to these resources requires an enormous investment of time and labor while producing painfully low rates of return. Having a career as an artist has become as laborious as running a small, under-resourced arts organization, but with fewer resources. Artists are working for free, sourcing opportunities, writing grants and proposals, self-promoting, networking with presenters, producers, gallerists, and publishers, and more. And this is to say nothing of ongoing training, finding ways to stay creatively inspired, and time for unstructured, open-ended imagining. Finally, the often hidden truth Dershowitz makes explicit is that economic advantages within the system are essential for professional viability, let alone success. Advantages like spousal or family support mean spending more time on pursuing art and less on other activities required for survival. Having privileged access to donor networks, promoters, producers, and other market gatekeepers also improves the likelihood of standing out in the crowd. These advantages make professional careers in the arts possible, and these are class-based privileges with implications that cut across dimensions of social location. Given these realities, Canadian artists and many of their supporters are advocating for a guaranteed basic income. How else to level the playing field inside an industry so deeply entrenched in the dynamics of neoliberal capitalism and its inherent inequalities? But let's be clear that the call to arms for social relief for artists is only made necessary by the way the system is exploiting them to begin with. In the same way that late-stage capitalism is amplifying wealth inequality and therefore heightening the demand for social supports across many facets of society, a guaranteed basic income for artists is necessary because our system of cultural production has so significantly eroded the value of the arts and compromised the artist's ability to make a livable income in this system. The precarious economic situation of the artist is very much putting at stake the ability of the arts to retain its independence and freely express its truth. What then is at stake for a society when artists are no longer able to freely express their truths? What happens when artists no longer have time to steep themselves in imagination? When they are too mired in trying to stay afloat economically to ever contemplate, reflect, experiment, and allow newness to emerge? One of the greatest challenges artists face at this moment is that the industry we work in is steeped in the rules, dynamics, and cultural norms that we are seeking to disrupt. Our near impossible task is to disentangle ourselves from a worldview that celebrates individualism, that chases production progress and economic growth at the expense of human and planetary health, that uses power as a form of control instead of as an abundant source of fuel that catalyzes our individual and collective ability to achieve purpose, and that commodifies every gift of our shared existence, from the water we drink to our time, attention, and labor. In this world, art as a way of knowing is devalued. Art as a process of imagining new worlds is relegated to the realm of entertainment and distraction. Artists are reduced to producers of commodities invested in by governments to fuel economic development. If we as a culture sector don't experiment radically with ways of disrupting this worldview, we will inevitably continue to propagate it. Part 2. From culture as a colonial project to culture as a lever for change. Decolonization is presencing what is absent. Melanie Goodchild. Developing Canada's nationhood through a robust government-sponsored system of cultural production has been a highly effective strategy of the colonial project. The Massey Commission of the 1950s gave birth to a Canadian culture, distinct from our American neighbors and reflective of Canada's British and French colonial roots. Today, we can look back on a considerable legacy of national cultural institutions, Canadian-made artwork, and Canadian art heroes that were seeded and nurtured by the state. The truth of this legacy, however, the legacy of the nation we call Canada, is that it came at an unconscionable cost to human life and dignity. In the name of creating a national culture, Canada was simultaneously enacting a cultural genocide. The systematic erasure of Indigenous peoples along with their cultures and languages is a shameful and devastating part of our legacy of nation building, as is the enslavement of Black peoples, the subjugation of Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian populations through indentured labor, and the oppression of Jewish and other ethnic minority people and cultures. At this moment, we are facing a very hard truth about the process of creation that made Canada. Today, in this increasingly pluralistic post-nationalist society colonially known as Canada, It is essential that Canada support cultural sovereignty for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We must honor the TRC calls to action as well as the recommendations for justice in the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women. The work of cultural transformation cannot begin without it. To build a new foundation of cultural democracy for a future Canada, we must reimagine cultural policies in support of a much more pluralistic expression of the sociocultural context that we share. To do this, we simply cannot continue to privilege classical Eurocentric art aesthetics by disproportionately distributing funds to the large institutions that promote them. Art forms like ballet, opera, classical music, a historical canon of European visual art, and the like have a place in the Canadian cultural landscape. Their state-sponsored dominance, however, can no longer be justified. The fact that these institutions are frequented primarily by affluent patrons, receive annual government grants and private donations totaling in the millions each year, benefit uniquely from taxpayer-matched endowment funds, and operate at a scale exponentially greater than most others in the field is impossible to reconcile with the imperative of building a cultural democracy. While these institutions consume the lion's share of resources, the rest of us, working across a broad range of cultural forms and practices, collectively reaching a highly diverse group of people and communities, remain relegated to the grassroots battlegrounds. Here, we work in a domain of highly competitive, all-or-nothing project funding, micro-granting, and Kickstarter campaigns. While some organizations occupy a more comfortable middle ground with more regular and predictable government funding, they also struggle to fulfill an essential bridging role across a widening gap in the so-called ecosystem between the best and worst resource players. In many cases, these mid-scale organizations are the pseudo-institutions of a particular cultural context or form of practice, playing a critical role within the field that extends beyond a typical creation and production mandate. While disheartening, this should be no surprise because Canada's cultural policies were never designed to reflect the context or processes of a wide range of cultural expressions present in our country's diversifying population. Significant historical inequities remain, despite the ways in which policies have shifted incrementally over time to include support for a more diverse palette of cultural expression. The multicultural society proposed by Canada's expanded cultural policy project is still very much imbued with the features and organizing principles of colonialism. It has been a project of othering, where a dominant Eurocentric culture retains its centrality. Decades of advocacy efforts on the part of under-supported artists and equity-seeking groups continue today under the banner of sovereignty, anti-oppression, anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. However, diverse human and cultural identities simply represented within a colonial white supremacist, heteropatriarchal ableist system risk being exotified, tokenized, and co-opted to further the aims of the original colonial project. Representation within the system, as it was designed, risks producing the same old outcomes. It's the very design of the system that we need to concern ourselves with. To design a more just system, one that more equally distributes the benefits and burdens it produces, we can't simply recalibrate an old system to become more fair and efficient, nor can we simply reorganize the distribution of power along identity lines, maintaining the existing architecture. We need to engage in a more fundamental process of creation, organized around principles of cultural plurality, equity and justice, sustainability, creative engagement, collective care and well-being, and others. Radical disruption in the arts means reevaluating things like standards of artistic excellence, measures of public value, and economic viability. It means unpacking the implicit biases hidden underneath notions of talent and merit. It means challenging hierarchies and reorganizing power structures so that shifts in policy and resource distribution will be informed by a plurality of cultural experiences and aesthetics. This is how we start to shift away from a system that has been aligned with the Western worldview inside a neoliberal capitalist society. In recent years, there has been growing attention to the imperative of updating Canada's cultural policy framework by replacing the outdated narratives of the 70-year-old Massey Commission. Indeed, imagining the rules of the system and the ways in which those rules govern the distribution of coveted resources is critical, but only part of the equation. What must be disrupted are the patterns of behavior in the current system and what those behaviors have been conditioned to be. We in the arts embody the rules and dynamics we have been shaped by. We have been enculturated by this system. And our most challenging project is to disentangle ourselves from the habits of being this system has shaped us to carry out. To let go of the habits that reify and perpetuate the old system and embrace ways of being that will shape a future world, we need to heal, learn, experiment, and practice. While policies and resources make change possible, practice is what makes change sustainable. The global social justice movement that was amplified following the murder of George Floyd in the US on May 25, 2020, has accelerated the urgency to create a new social contract, one that addresses the pervasiveness of racism and other social inequities woven through our social fabric. In Canada, the legacies of colonization are still unfolding, and if we weren't aware before, the pandemic has shed light on any lingering ignorance. A health crisis, a policing crisis, a housing crisis, an economic crisis, a crisis of well-being, a crisis of spirit, a crisis of care. The need for a revolution couldn't be more of an emergency. In the arts, the call for a cultural transformation growing from the momentum of Idle No More, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and Indigenous resurgence movements has helped to center and lift up the work of women, Indigenous, Black, POC, and other equity-seeking artists. However, it's important to acknowledge that for those in power, equity-seeking artists and their work have also become a new kind of cultural capital, ready to be leveraged through very fresh diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. This might be a step toward the kind of long-term transformative change we are seeking, if it manages to resist becoming a passing fad, acting as a kind of public relations campaign in a moment of social justice consciousness. The work of building a culture liberated from the historical colonial ethos Canada is embedded in is a project for a generation or more. It involves working at the levels of self, structure, system, and culture. It involves visioning a cultural democracy capable of reflecting a culturally pluralistic citizenry in a post-colonial society. For many arts organizations, the work of dismantling systems of oppression has only just begun. Relationships that bridge class and power divides are nascent, as are collective learning processes focused on embodying more inclusive, equitable cultures. Institutions will not likely lead the way toward a new world because of how entangled they are in the dynamics of the world that made them. The pursuit of reconciling historical inequities through diversified representation and policy reform has been a focus for many arts and culture organizations through the pandemic. This alone will be a failing strategy for our sector if the goal is long-term systemic change. Elizabeth Dory Tunstall, Dean of Design at OCADU, made this case elegantly in her keynote address at SEPAMO's last Gathering Divergence Festival in May. As the first ever in the world Black female design school dean, she referred to herself as a super token. Invited as a Black woman into a dominantly white institution, diversity, she says, is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being invited to dance the dances the host knows, the foxtrot, the waltz. Equity is to make room for the dances she knows and to make dancing them a part of the culture that all members of the institution participate in. What her metaphor illustrates is that requesting better representation in a system designed to enact the same dynamics of oppression inherent in a wider system of heteropatriarchal white supremacy is an incomplete recipe for change. and in fact, becoming a super token inside organizations where real cultural shifts are not consciously in progress. Leaders of color and other equity-seeking individuals may find themselves more subjected to harm than empowered to lead change within the dynamics of elite social control so deeply embedded in the governance of the arts industry and its institutions. To really do the work of the revolution, we need to look beyond strategies of diversified representation and policy reform and work at the level of culture. We need to reshape our ways of being together across our differences, divesting ourselves of the human hierarchy so present in our society. To work at the level of culture, we need to engage in embodied creative processes that work with the materials of meaning-making, rituals and symbols, codes of behavior, communal language and storytelling, rules of belonging. This is what helps us expand into new possibilities, and this is the work of the artist. Through the transformative power of our creative practices, artists are especially and uniquely capable of catalyzing the kind of systems change we need right now by leading at the level of culture change. To do this well, artists need to uncouple themselves from the concepts, structures, and dynamics that are producing current systemic harms. Liberating ourselves from a system of oppression that we periodically benefit from is a significant act of resistance. And it is particularly difficult to enact, either because of how precarious our professional artistic lives are to begin with, or because of our relative privilege within it. We rely on every and any small benefit afforded to us by the system. We work ourselves regularly into states of burnout. We never say no because we can't. We focus on artistic activities that have the best chance of being funded and promoted. We hang on tightly to the belief that over time it will get better and even easier, but it doesn't. The return on our emotional, spiritual, and creative investment is shockingly unacceptable. To transcend these dynamics where we artists are too often exploited in our own industry, we need to experiment with new ways of working that are better aligned with the world we want to live in. Part 3, artists as world makers. Art is an effort to create, beside the real world, a more humane world. André Marois. To reimagine Canadian culture, what I'm proposing is the centering of the individual artist and their honed ability to experiment with emergent artistic practice as an organizing strategy during this transitional time between worlds. Returning to my earlier question, if artists were ambitiously mobilized to engage fully in the transformative potential of their creative practice, could they lead the way toward a new world? If we put more of our attention on individual artists concerned with emergence and less on the system concerned with the emergency, could we better catalyze change? Artistic process is, by its very nature, emergent. It is a process capable of world-making because it explores horizons of possibility in ways that engage our fully embodied sensory capacities, including our imagination. Creation processes value integrated forms of knowledge production, including intuition, perception, and emotion. As such, these are processes capable of working on our ways of being, as well as on our ways of thinking and doing, all within the volatile conditions we find ourselves in, those of complexity, disconnection, and uncertainty. Processes that prioritize felt sense experience have been increasingly subjugated by our hyper-rational, data-driven culture of information overload. As such, they feel less and less familiar in our society as processes that support our collective evolution. However, artists know that these processes are integral to the creation of meaning, which in turn catalyzes change. As Seth Godin puts it in his 2015 audiobook, Leap First, Creating Work That Matters, to create meaning is to change something for the better, A meaningful artistic experience can move us toward new understanding, engagement, and action. Because of our practiced ability to create meaning, we artists can and often do disrupt old interpretations of a shared reality. We tell new stories, offer up new metaphors, and resituate familiar ideas in unfamiliar contexts. Through our processes of creation, we artists also spend time imagining futures that don't yet exist, priming the public imagination with an expanded set of possibilities for our shared existence. Artistic experience invites a plurality of interpretations to emerge, contributing to the socialization of experiential knowledge about our collective existence. This is a fundamental tenet of a democratic society. When artists engage in processes of creation, something comes into existence that didn't exist before. Something new is invented. This process, according to Arts Action Research, is a unique combination of vision, creativity, intuition, and collaboration balanced with craft, technique, accountability, discipline, and use of time and resources. The artistic process is, without qualification or quantification, the most effective planning, problem-solving, decision-making, relationship-building process available to anyone. Artistic processes are focused primarily on invention rather than innovation, though the two are often confused. According to Julia Kagansky, director of New Inc., the New Museum's Art, Technology, and Design Incubator in New York City, invention prompts us to imagine how things could be, offering new propositions that aren't bound by the realities of how things are. Innovation, however, is bound to what already exists. It is about optimizing, replicating, and scaling, and it is deeply tied to organizing principles of efficiency, growth, competition, and maximizing profit. Innovation does not set out to build a foundation for a new world. It proposes improvements built upon existing structures. How can we address imperatives of decoloniality, health and well-being, and environmental and social justice using the same tools and processes that created the conditions we find ourselves in to begin with? Audre Lorde said it best, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Kagansky goes on to say that focusing on innovation in a time of great change and disruption can limit our potential to explore, inviting only incremental change rather than the paradigm-shifting change that we seek. Innovation, it seems, is a strategy connected to the emergency, while invention is about the revolution. If we want to disrupt and reimagine, rather than optimize and improve the current system of cultural production, could we lean into processes focused on bringing something into existence that didn't exist before? In this moment of disruption, can we soften our attachment to production in order to experiment and learn? Can we stop working toward world premieres and openings as though they are an end game where art stops evolving? Can we hit pause on our impulse to innovate and instead steep ourselves for a moment in the chaotic realm of artistic creation? Artists are already experimenting with new ways of doing things. We are inviting new rituals, practicing new ways of collaborating, testing new rhythms, and investigating new organizing principles. These experiments are happening right now in studios and rehearsal halls, living rooms and parks, all in service of culture change. Artistic processes are not always or often optimizable and repeatable because they are so relational and conditional. However, this makes them particularly relevant as catalysts for transformational change in a highly complex, transitioning world. As artists know, every creation is unique, embedded in a unique set of relationships and circumstances. To navigate the unknown terrain of making art, artists often form communities where mutual support, learning, dialogue, exchange, and a sharing of resources occurs. From this initially chaotic, unstructured space, new insights come to light. This is heartening because to transition to a new world, we need a new how, an ontology that is aligned with our reclaimed understanding that we are relational beings that belong to and are a part of a larger natural planetary system. Unlike a strategy, model, or framework, an ontology is connected to the nature of how our reality is organized. Said differently, it is a way of being expressed through culture. It is a set of values and principles enacted in a multiplicity of ways. Unsurprisingly, multiplicity, this available abundance of perspectives, collides head-on with our conditioned Western ways of knowing. But if we continue to pursue the singular, objective truths promised by Western Enlightenment thinking, we will miss the plethora of possible pathways to a new world. Even in spite of notable counter-narratives within, truths, in the plural, remain antithetical to the Western project at large. It is fundamental to a cultural democracy that the world we all belong to be authored through diverse expressions of the human experience. Part 4. From emergency to emergence, detaching from the current system to build the next one. We are addicted to the highway because that's all modernity can offer us. We need to become fugitives. Bio Akomolafe. Our challenge as artists will be to become fugitives of this system of cultural production we are embedded in. We will need to examine the habits of being we've adopted to survive in this system, resisting conditioned tendencies that no longer serve us. Our near impossible task is to balance our competitive pursuit of scarce resources with the work of collective advancement. We need to work together to create a new vision for a world that doesn't yet exist. It is not enough to agree on all the ways the system is broken, creating harm and producing all the same outcomes it was designed for. If we want to do the work of transformation, we need to stop trying to win in a game designed to make sure most of us lose. This is, after all, how the system keeps us under control and on the periphery. Instead, we must direct at least some of our scarce emotional, spiritual, and creative resources toward a collective horizon. And we need to do this together across a spectrum of power and privilege. To dismantle the oppressive design of the current system, we artists need to soften our grip on the imperative of production, shift our relationship to time, and deepen our engagement in creative processes capable of remaking our world. Doesn't that sound wonderful? We need to experiment with processes of creation that center new values and then contribute our learning into a collective body of knowledge. We need to first get lost in the chaos of not knowing, creating the conditions for a new system's design to emerge. By insisting on space for creative experimentation and discovery, we can challenge familiar norms and disentangle ourselves from the concepts embedded in the current system. This is what we need to do to heal from the harms of an old world and expand into new possibilities. We can turn away from notions of artistic excellence and instead imagine new ways of understanding how art creates meaning in our lives. We can challenge concepts of explicit value, public impact, and evaluation when we engage with ways of knowing beyond what is measurable. We can mitigate the damaging effects of unrestrained extraction, progress, and growth by committing to the work of reconnection and reclamation, imagining a sustainable world. We can challenge the logic of hierarchical power and dominance that holds the old system in place by continuing to engage equitably across differences as an essential condition of a healthy creative environment and therefore a healthy ecosystem. We can tell a new story about the essential role of the arts in society. This is the work of the revolution, and it's already underway. This work is not unprecedented. Throughout human history, there are examples of countercultures, organized resistance, and mobilization in times of crisis. We as artists need to claim a place of greater agency because the world needs us right now. Governments and funders are actively deploying resources with a consciousness that the world of tomorrow needs to be different from the world of today. The mistake our system of cultural production keeps making over and over in this emergency is excluding a focus on radical experimentation with art-making practices as a lever for systems change. Artists are languishing, and what is not good for artists is not good for art. All of us working in this system of cultural production, funders, producers, policymakers, presenters, researchers, educators, donors, all of you out there, we need to ask, what interventions can we make that will radically mobilize artists to do their most important work? Where within the system could these interventions most effectively disrupt the status quo and seed change? One possibility is that various actors across the system of cultural production could direct more programs and resources toward experimentation and discovery over production and distribution. What could we learn if we took the time to understand how artists are working and what they are discovering, rather than simply what they are making and how successful it is in the cultural marketplace? And what could these lessons offer society at large as we all grapple with the existential challenges of our time? Another unexplored opportunity is to leverage the advantages of the arm's-length funding model in Canada that allows for the distribution of funds to individual artists and informal structures, groups, collectives, and networks, unconstrained by the more formally and colonially structured charitable not-for-profit model. The structures of the old world are the disabling constraint of the emergent ways of the new. We need to limit funding that amplifies and perpetuates old world models, and instead prioritize and grow pools of funding for supporting process-based research and experimentation, uncoupled from ultimate goals of production and distribution, so that we can learn. Arts funders can participate in this work by directing internal resources toward better understanding the role and impact of artist-led work within the ecosystem, analyzing data collected from funding applications that to date remains inert as a catalyst for shared understanding or change. Finally, we need to create new social support systems for artists so they can pursue careers that have a chance at being viable. Having time and space to run the business of our careers is paramount to having one in the first place. Until artists are compensated for their work in a way that adequately supports both the direct and indirect costs of making it, we will continue to endorse a stratified system where only those with economic privileges can be artists. Social support such as guaranteed basic income will better enable artists to participate equitably as engaged citizens in the important conversations about how our sector and our society is organized. This is how we invest in a cultural democracy. This is how we build back a better Canada. Attending radically to all the ways that artists are experimenting with art-making processes right now is my hopeful proposal for bringing to light new insights that can help guide us into a post-pandemic world. From these artist-led discoveries that are grounded in values of care, creative possibility, social justice, interdependence, and sustainability, a new world will emerge. Thank you very much. Woo, made it through. So just to have a moment of transition here, I would like to introduce our panelists, but first we are going to meet them through their art. So we have a set of 3 reels that will include work by Susie Burpee, Irma Villafuerte, and Anita La Selva. So we'll see that reel, and then we're going to hear a piece of poetry by Greg Frankson.
17. Ilusionada con ser médica. A ti, mi niña de 17, te escribo para abrazarte, para abrazar tu memoria.
Wow, thank you so much. I think it's so important to meet artists through their art. So just before I invite Greg to share a piece of his writing, I just want to introduce this panel. So the first reel that we saw was Irma Villafuerte, who is a dance artist and educator based in Takaranto from Nahuatl territory, Cuscanton, post-colonial El Salvador. I hope I said that right. Her passion for social justice and her identity as a Salvadorian in the diaspora is the driving force for creation in Irma's choreographic and performance work. And so Irma is at the far end of the table. Now in the middle is Susie Burpee, and that's the second piece that we saw. Traversing both dance and theater, Susie Burpee's artistic work includes choreography, performance, and teaching. Susie is also artistic producer of Theater Direct's Balancing Act, a national initiative to support parents and caregivers who work in the performing arts. And the third reel we saw was Anita La Selva, who is a director, dramaturg, actor, and creator, and is the 2019 recipient of the Gina Wilkinson Award for Emerging Female Director. And she teaches at York University and the Seneca College acting programs. And finally, Greg Frankson, a writer and editor of Africanthology, Perspectives of Black Canadian Poets. from Renaissance Press, coming out in 2022. Greg is also an inductee to the Verse Ottawa Hall of Honor, a former Canadian Poetry Slam champion, and past poet laureate of the International Initiative for Mental Health Leadership. So welcome, wonderful artists. And so just before we dive into this conversation, I'll invite Greg to share with us a piece of his work.
Thank you, Shannon. This poem comes from the African Anthology collection, and it's called The Blackened Room. Open the door. Step inside the contours of your fear. Caress the warp in your perception that braids devastation to your cranium tight like rows of Negro corn. As each footfall draws you deeper, wrap yourself in the blackness like a discomforted comforter, too warm that leaves you sweaty, restless, confused, discombobulated equilibrium. Dissolve matter into the ether. Argue spiritedly with the lives you'd meant to live before this. The door groans shut behind you, cuts off all possibility of escape, bidden by the highest bidder who enslaves you to new terror, bitter as the sea salt that transported anxiety-addled chattel from foreign sands through the hourglass. You are diminished, once plucked from indigenous land and cast onto red-soaked soil unfit for your roots, shrunk down to near enough to nothingness, pulverized in aggregate to be ground down into building blocks of oppressive freedom. Shackled by the petrification of ambition and unfreed wills, a testament to the death of one's hope. Newly nested in pathology that holds you fetal, fragile like an eggshell, broken open, oozes unrestrained like a liquefied scream. A race to fill cracks and crevices whips quickly across sullen floorboards, desperate search for unattainable wholeness in the fetid, dank vacuum of a space that proffers no gentle companionship on the journey to pernicious perdition. Just a middle passage from here to where fear lurks in dark corners, waiting.
Nice. Thank you so much, Greg. Whew. Well, how to begin? So just to lead us into this conversation, I wanted to start by asking each of our panelists to just share a bit of a reflection on their artistic practice and maybe a bit about kind of the scope of your career at this point, because you're all sort of at different career moments. And so I'd love to hear about that. And maybe Irma, if it's okay, we'll start with you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh yeah, sorry. Good afternoon, everybody here and at home. I'm Irma Villafuerte, and I'm a dance artist based in Toronto. I'm an arts educator as well, and an activist. I've been an activist for what it feels like my entire life. I've also been raised by an activist, so it just feels like it's part of my upbringing. I'm also a daughter of refugees, so a lot of my work in Toronto is based on my experience as a refugee, and also a granddaughter of a missing woman during the war in El Salvador. So it's been like the foundation of my work, and which has led me to then dive into other works that encompass social justice narratives through the Latin American context. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Anita, can I invite you to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Anita La Selva, and I am primarily I work in theater. My background is as a theater artist and dance artist. And I guess my career has taken on many different scopes. I started off as a sort of a dancer actor, and then have evolved into directing, dramaturgy, creation. I focus a lot now on interdisciplinary creation, trying to work with different disciplines, and also intercultural work, reflecting my own very hybrid cultural background. So that's very important to me, is working in a very pluralistic way, both with disciplines as well as culture. I also teach. Yeah, I feel that my identity as an artist is one of true hybridity, which I feel like I've embraced, and I think that's something that so many of us artists have to do right now is embrace that, and I've really come to like that. At first, it felt like a lot of the hybridity was out of like, what am I going to do next? And now it's something that I feel like has made me stronger as an artist all around. That's what I'll say for now.
Great, thank you. Susie, Burpee, over to you. I think actually we can take the mic off the stand here.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here and with all of you. I'm Susie, and I'm originally from rural Manitoba, second generation settler on Treaty 1 territory there, and also the homeland of the Métis Nation. But I have traveled across the country as an artist, working in contemporary dance, informed by a Western Eurocentric tradition. I have created work, I've danced for dance companies, and as I started to explore what my voice was in the work, I also engaged with the dark clown. So Buffon, Philippe Gaulier was an influence. And I was thinking, Shannon, as you were talking about sustainability, that it was engaging with the clown side most recently, like in the last, say, 3 to 4 years, where I started to see these windows into my work as a practice-based thing. So to jump into an alter ego, a bewigged character, and to consider her a practice and what she can do in the world, what the practice of her does in the world. So sometimes I show up as this other person, not today. It's tempting. She's always in the closet.
Great, thanks. And Greg, over to you.
So I'm a proud Scarborough native. Grew up, it was right straight out of the borough. And, I started off in music, really, singing in choirs as a youth, and then graduating into the world of hip hop. And, being around and being part of that initial bubbling up. And I continued to engage in that until my early 20s. And after graduating from university, those musical elements that I learned from singing, the hip hop sensibility, and then combining it in love with I had ever since I was old enough to read and write on my own. And that led me into the creation of my spoken word career, which has taken me to 3 continents, through the Caribbean, working and creating my particular style of slam, a very rhythmic musical style that then evolved and has now led me into a world of creative nonfiction and writing mostly these days, not for the stage, but for the page in poetic prose. And so it's kind of been a really interesting journey that has circled through as well, with all of those threads of the social justice to now become paramount and front and center in my work, both as an artist and as a community informed advocate.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So the first kind of part of the essay, I really kind of lean into this question of the precarity of the artist. And this is sometimes hard for artists to talk about, because the ways that our lives are precarious can make us feel like we're not artists or not enough artist, or that we are not successful enough. So I just want to acknowledge that from the top, because the artists that are joining me have agreed to talk about this, for the benefit of all of us artists out there, on what precarity is for them. And so I'll just open with this question: is how do you experience or witness the condition of precarity for artists through your life and career? And maybe, Anita, do you mind if we start with you on this one?
Yeah.
Yes, feel free to just take the mic off the stand. Yeah.
All right, there we go. Fancy. Okay. Yeah, I feel for myself, and also for so many artists that I've witnessed throughout my career, which spans well over 25 years now, that so many of us live day to day wondering whether we can continue to be artists. And that is a daily, weekly, monthly concern for so many artists. In that, can we make a living? Can we have families? Can we afford to have a place to live other than living in a tiny little, hovel? Can we afford to see the world, which helps us create our art? And can we expose ourselves to different things? And yes, we need money for that. And so often I see other artists, the number of friends who I started out with in the business in probably the early 1990s, I'd say about at least 70% have left the business in the theater world. And I'm now with less than 30% of my colleagues, probably closer to 25, who are still artists. I want to talk a little bit about the whole burnout factor that Shannon talks about in her thing, because I think so many artists who are freelance artists like myself, we live a sense of, will I ever work again? And will I be hired? Will I be able to create my work? Will I get that grant? And so we take on so many projects that we burn ourselves out, and that we are constantly working in a state of project to project and then juggling other jobs. And on a personal level, I chose to go back to school and do an MFA in directing so that I could teach at the college and university level, knowing that if I did not, I might not be able to sustain myself as an artist, and that I would have to go out and get a day job, and a regular day job. And that was something I did not want to do. And I was very fortunate because I've taught for all of my life, and I love teaching, and it was something that comes naturally to me, and I really enjoy the process of mentoring and teaching. And so it was a very logical choice for me to do. And at the age of 40, I went back to school and did an MFA, and then was able now to qualify. So now part of how I sustain myself as an artist is through teaching. And it is a balance for me now that I teach so that I can have the freedom to create my projects, and so that I know that if my projects aren't getting funded, at least I can sustain myself so that I can pay my fellow artists, because that's how precarious it is. And I know that so many artists that I want to engage and that I want to hire are living hand to mouth. So I always ensure that, okay, if I can make some money teaching, then I'll take care of myself, so that the grant money that I get, I can funnel to my artists. So I end up not paying myself a lot of the time. So many, I will put producer, Anita LaSalva, director, Anita LaSalva. And then chances are my funding comes in short and I don't have enough money for that. And I'm like, no problem, because I don't need that producer salary. I don't need that director salary, because my artists need it, because I can at least know that my teaching is going to pay my rent. But as a result, though, I'm not making any money as a creator. And that is the vicious circle, and that's the precarity of us as artists, is that so many of us have been forced to find different ways to sustain ourselves so that we can create art and also live in a world that is, I could go on, and I don't want to take up too much time, but we talk about the whole sense of privilege, in the sense that, when you don't come from a place of privilege and having money from other places, you find it yourself. So I've tried to create this sense of safety for myself, because I don't come from privilege, so that at least I know that I can cover my rent and cover what I need to cover, so that I can help other artists by funneling my grant money to them, so that they can put food on their table while they're working on my project. And that's exhausting, and that's where the burnout comes in. And I think that's where the precarity of so many of our lives come in that so many artists don't know where their rent is going to come from, where their grocery bill is going to come from, how they're going to raise their kids, how they're going to buy stuff for their kids, so that they are forced then to find other ways to leave the business or find other means of supporting themselves. And so I just feel like we need a big sense of generosity right now. And those of us who have and who have not, and we need to find ways to work together so that we can balance that out, so that we can get paid for what we do as artists, even a little bit, and also make sure that our fellow artists are being supported around us. I think that's one of my biggest concerns. My biggest concern is, did so-and-so at least get some money for that? Is so-and-so struggling? Because I'm so acutely aware of that precarity, and I've been there myself, and had to work hard to pull myself away from that place, but not as to the same degree as some of my colleagues have. But that took sacrifices too. I had to take time out from my career. I had to, But I think training and education is brilliant on any level because it opens our minds. I'll be quiet. I've said enough. I've said enough.
That's
I've said enough.
great.
I can go on.
I saw the nodding heads across
said
the
enough.
panel. I can feel the nodding heads out there in the Zoom room. And by the way, audience in the Zoom room, feel free to use the chat. I am monitoring the chat as best as I can. So if you want to resonate with things that are said, add anything, we will take questions a little bit more formally later. But feel free to resonate with your remarks in the chat as we go along. Irma, can I turn it over to you? This question of like, how do we make up our artist lives? Like, how many jobs do artists have? How do we do this?
I kind of like also riding off your wave a bit, Anita, is like I've experienced precarity, I think, since the beginning of even being an artist. I started dancing when I was 12 years old as a salsa dancer. That's like the main training that I have. And I was very fortunate to not have to pay for training. I just kind of went to dance classes at La Classique and someone picked me up, not like picked me up, but like, hey, you want to train? And I was 14 and they trained me for free because, my mom, like I grew up in a poor household, being refugees in this country, even though my mom had been here for many years, like she resorted to, the basic working class jobs, cleaning, which sometimes I had to go and do with her, or taking care, like as a caregiver. And eventually, even though my mom has, a significant experience in El Salvador as an activist and also as a social worker, it didn't seem to really qualify in this country. So, I started working when I was 12 years old at, Center Island. And I would go to school and I would go to my salsa classes in the evenings and just kind of hustle that way up until in my 20s when I finally joined Mata Dance Collective. And in Mata Dance Collective, for those that have witnessed the work that we did, we were a grassroots collective doing all kinds of performance work throughout the city, in Venezuela, in El Salvador, in the States. And we never got paid. All of our work was in a grassroots level. It was at political events, which also caused, some of us in the collective to be seen through the loop of the Canadian government at that time, which was Stephen Harper's government, which was a very scary situation because of the content that we talked about. We worked with No One Is Illegal. We worked with the Toronto Rape Crisis Center and different organizations that were doing very important work. And the reality is we, as a 7 women people collective, we would get sometimes $100 or $50 for a performance. And we were constantly doing that and pointing that to our funds, and we never got paid individually. And we self-trained ourselves. So I came in with my salsa skills. Lilia Leon came with her contemporary skills. Olivia Davies with her ballet skills. Grisette Severino with her theater skills. Victoria and Misette with their Afro-Venezuelan skills. And we would teach each other. And we would open up our classes for training ourselves and training people of our community. And yeah, that was a precarity because we all had to work full-time jobs. I've been working, service jobs since I was 19, 20 years old. And those of you who know me very well know, how demanding that is. And it was only in my late 20s that I decided that, wow, I have all this performance experience. I've traveled the world technically as a performer doing social justice work through the arts. I think I just kind of want to be in a ballet class and not feel I'm getting like run over. So I decided to join a post-secondary program in my late 20s. And I literally paid for that program on my own because I also couldn't get any loans from the government, from the banks. They didn't give me loans because, anyways, long story, I was in a relationship that screwed me over anyways, but it's okay. I'm good now. And I worked every single weekend, and I was in school from Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. because also after the professional development program, I was also training with Cuban contemporary teachers, which, was a passion of mine. And then I was working every single weekend from 6 a.m. to like 11 p.m. and the hustle was real. And post-graduating from that program in my late 20s, turning 30 is when I finally landed my first gig, first paid gig. And that's like been working since I was 12 years old as an artist, working through the social justice field in the arts, never getting paid truly. And until I, post-graduation in my early 30s is when I first received what it was like to be paid like an hourly wage as an artist. And it was like, I was, wait, what? Like this happens? And it was like amazing. And also it created a sort of grieving of everything that I had experienced prior to that, and everything that a lot of folks like me who didn't have a particular training and schooling that is the norm, I guess, to in artist training in order to make the money that you want to make a living. And yeah, so I experienced that for the majority of my 20s, and in my 30s I began to find work, or I guess invited to be parts of work that were, I guess, somewhat funded, but I still haven't let go of that service job. I still continue to do, and I have been doing that service job for 16 years because I don't want to recreate the same emotional instability that I had as a child, to live that paycheck to paycheck style, to not know that I'm going to have something that will pay for my food, my rent, my dog's food, you know what I mean? Whatever little things, and also my training, because I also, as a dancer, we have to train, right? If we stop training, then we're not fit enough to be on stage, which is a whole other, a whole other thing to talk about.
I mean, something that you're bringing up for me is this idea that, there might be an expectation that things are difficult in the early parts of your career, where it takes time to build up a profile and to have some early opportunities to build your resume. But then I think artists imagine that at some point this actually starts to get easier. But does it really? I mean, maybe Susie, you could speak to this a bit as someone who's like, fully into, many years into your career. Like, does it actually get easier after you've built your resume and had a few paid opportunities and toured the world a bit? Does it get easier?
I think I'll share that story that we spoke about. Feels like that's the prompt. That's good. I'm very, very highly directable. But yeah, so I'm going to share the story that's not intended as a poor me story, but rather to illustrate a system that is broken. So from about 2006 to 2010, I feel like I had what you'd consider in contemporary dance to be a successful career. And I want to acknowledge and name that the conditions of white privilege and also my form being attached to Western Eurocentric aesthetic is a part of that success. But success looking like getting many of the grants that I asked for, like a really high rate of return there, and also touring my work across the country. So being able to present my work in many cities. But in 2010, I'm telling Shannon, I was $10,000 in debt because I was trying to keep up. Someone talked about the go, 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 I think, Anita. I was trying to keep up with making work, with paying the folks that I was working with, a thriving wage, not even just a fair wage. I was an independent artist, so no organizational structure around me, and just trying to do my best. And again, I use the word best in the context of success too, because we understand that our system is a meritocracy, and words like best and excellence are dangerous words. But I was a product of a system that caused me to think in this way and caused me to continue to try and, use my resources, all the resources that I had, clearly. So yes, I and what am I? I'm 50 now. So at that time, I can't do the math fast enough. I really can't. So almost 40. So, that's mid to later stage career. But the system still wasn't working even in this context. So just how a presenting fee of $2,000, in Calgary is not going to pay for the remount of the work, is not going to pay for all the artists involved. and the things that need to happen in order to achieve that. The economies of time and labor don't add up. So fast forward to this panel and this conversation being so vital, and and also just how these system traumas, I guess, cut across social location. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Susie. I mean, I think I think this is what I mean when I say in the essay that the system exploits artists. Like, I'm not trying to shake my fist at everyone. I think this is actually how it works, like how it's been designed to work. That in fact, those who are in positions of power are able to make an offer of any kind to an artist. And like, are you going to say, as an artist, you're going to say, no, actually, I don't want you to present my work because I think that you're not offering me enough funding to support the cost that it will, the cost of it coming to you. But then another artist might say yes. And so I think this is what I mean by the exploitation, that whatever that difference is between like what the most powerful players are able to offer artists, we take it and we make up the difference with our time, with our labor, with our own money, with the extra jobs that we work to cover our cost of living so we don't have to pay ourselves and we can pay all the other artists involved in our projects. Like, this is a real and tangible thing that happens all the time. For very successful people, this happens all the time. And so I just want to highlight that and then turn it over to Greg to add his perspective, because you come from a somewhat a different discipline in the arts. So what has that experience been like for you?
So that's interesting because as a literary artist, it's more like a choose your own precarity kind of situation. And what I mean by that is, first, when you come in, as a poet, you're just looking for a stage, any stage. Anybody will hand you a microphone and give you 3 or 4 minutes to share a poem. I'm there. I'm all over that, like termites on wood. You know what I mean? So you just go there, you walk in, you just read your poem, you get whatever you get from the folks there. Maybe somebody will buy you a muffin or something in the coffee shop, and you're like, sweet. And that's how it is, because you're getting the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours under your belt, right? So you're just trying to get it done, get good at what you're doing, get through that period where you're mimicking what you're seeing on stage from others and actually developing your own voice and style. And then when you get to that point, then you start to be able to be like, okay, so now I'm going to ask for, $25 here, $50 here. Maybe I'll go and feature at a poetry slam show as a feature performer, and they'll pay me $100, maybe $150. Wow, this is amazing. And then you're starting to make a little bit of money. But I mean, in that point, you better be working, because, poets don't actually start to make money at any point along. I'm jealous of all y'all dancers, man. 'Cause you actually have an opportunity to make some money. There's sort of a running joke in the spoken word community, and they say that spoken word artists are the most poorly paid of all of the artists out there. We're even more poorly paid than mimes, and they have nothing to say. Okay? That is not my joke, but it is definitely a very good description of what it means to be a spoken word artist in Canada. And, and so you go through all of that, and then you get to a point where you start to establish yourself, establish your voice. I started to run organized shows. I would organize shows and put shows together, put poets on stage, connect poets with other poets in other cities, help them coordinate tours. I had poets come to me like, Greg, how did you manage to go out to the West Coast and do shows in Vancouver and New Westminster and Victoria and all that? They're like, listen, call this person, call this person, call this person, set it up so, and I just broke it down for them. Go. Nobody's paying me for that kind of time, for that kind of knowledge, for that ability to bring people together. Nobody pays me for that. That's what I do for the love. I give that back to the community because I want those poets to grow, right? So I'm doing that. But in any other industry, that kind of knowledge, people pay hundreds of dollars an hour for that kind of knowledge, right? But artists just do that because that's what we do. And then I got to a point where I was actually able to make enough money because I was doing speaking engagements. I was organizing shows. I was on the CBC. I was doing I was doing all of these other things that are sort of artistry adjacent. and piecing each one of those little pieces together such that I was actually one of the few people in spoken word who was making money off of being a creative person on an ongoing basis. And that only lasts for a certain amount of time, but now you're into precarity of time. How am I spending time with my family? How am I spending time with my friends? Am I sitting down with my grandmother who's getting older? I need to spend time with her. You know, am I able to spend time with my children? Are you able to connect with your friends? And so that becomes the precarity after you figure out the monetary precarity of making money through the art. And then you go through another cycle and you come back out the other side. And then there's new precarities. They're always showing up in different ways. You can become rich in one aspect of your life and your existence as an artist, and that in order to be richer in that area, you automatically have to impoverish yourself in another aspect. And that is the ongoing flow. At least for me, I can only speak for me, but that's what I've seen in the arts community.
So well said.
Yeah.
You nailed it. Nailed it.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm losing all my friends because all I do is work and make art, and I never see my family. I never see my friends. It's like no time. Because we're so busy.
That's right.
We're so busy.
Yeah. So, how do we stop this train? How do we do that? I want to shift us to chat a little bit about disruption, because of course we're in a world that is disrupted right now, and the focus of that disruption is like these major arenas of climate change, of social justice, of health and well-being. These are major, I don't even think they're issues anymore. They are simply like, this is the environment that we are now living in. One of injustice, one of climate disruption, and one of declining health and well-being. And I'm curious to know, as artists, how are you engaging with this condition right now in your work? And, the notion of care has come up a few times in some of what you've all said. And that seems to be, there's a consciousness around care as an organizing principle that has the potential to disrupt some of the kind of harmful ways the world works. And so maybe we could start with care. And I wonder if I could turn to you, Susie, just to start on that topic of care. So how are you engaging with care right now in your work?
So I work for Theatre Direct on a project called Balancing Act, which, as Shannon describes, supports parents and caregivers who are working in the performing arts. And one of the big projects that we're working on is how we can create wiser practices and policies. So looking at how we're working, and a lot of the things that we've been hearing in the rooms when we've just been having discussions with other artists and arts workers as well, so administrators and folks on the production side, is that there's this idea that the humanity has to get checked at the door. So looking at how these spaces have been shaped to become these, it's been described in some rooms as pristine or clean, that there's things that we can't bring in the room, our whole selves, our human side, our messiness. And that those pieces, the reason why they don't come in is because they can't be supported within the working environment. So along with a bunch of people, been looking at how to look at that. And I think the word care, well, I don't think the word care, I've come to understand the word care as really, about interdependence, that our survival is contingent upon one another. Mm-hmm. It's about showing our frailty when we give and receive care. That's what happens. And so therefore we understand that we need each other. And I think that connects to artists because we work relationally. We even in solo work, we still need the influence, the inspiration, the lighting design, or whatever the thing is. So yeah, it's that relational aspect, I think, that connects deeply to care. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone else would like to leap off.
Yeah, please dive in. Don't let me direct the conversation too much.
I'll go in then. I think a big part of the conversation around care, because I sort of see it at, 3 levels. There's self-care, and then there's care of the other artists, and then there's care of the community, because the community goes beyond the family of artists. It's everybody who participates in the art who should also be included in that third circle of care. And so when I think about care for oneself, it comes back around to, yes, those ideas around precarity, those ideas around time. I feel like you were saying earlier, I exist in a constant state of semi-burnout. I don't even know how I drove here today, honestly. It's like I got in the car and then I woke up and I'm like, oh snap, I'm in Regent Park, right? Because there is so much that's going on, and there's so many aspects, and I feel like I'm juggling 12 balls at all times. And I'm just like, could somebody just, decide that I'm so awesome they could just be my patron and I could just do art? Like, can we just go back to how it used to be in the old days? Like, patronage would be amazing, but since that world isn't coming back, how do I take care of myself enough to respect my own time, energy, and emotional resources to be able to both create and exist at the same time, while still being able to give care to others, to my family, to my friends, and then beyond that to the community of artists and to the community of artist consumers, for lack of a better term. And I think that the last piece of it too is care also has to talk about safety. And there is always that need to talk about, like, what does a safer space look like? There's no such thing as safe space. So what is a safer space? Who gets to decide what that safer space looks like? Who gets to define the parameters of who gets to enter those spaces and who gets excluded and on what basis? And and that has been fraught for me as a man, as a Black man, as an artist, as a person of Caribbean descent, and some of those stereotypical views that come with being of Jamaican extraction. So there's all of these other layers, both going inward and outward, that we also have to grapple with.
Something to what you were saying also is dismantling the way we work, dismantling the lack of connection in creation spaces in order to produce, which is connected to what you were mentioning in the essay. We like connecting, conversing, sharing is an educational part of the art making. And that is, we all deserve access to that at all times, and I feel like because we're working with such limited budgets, which is the most annoying thing in the world, to like work in this hourly way. It just feels like you're being constrained into a box, and you're only allowed to be creative for these 3 hours. And it's like, well, I kind of just want to cry for 2 hours, and then I want to actually see if we can produce something. So can I cry and gossip and like talk about the things that inspire me of life with my colleagues, and then we get into the stuff that's really gut-wrenching, because you know what, we're racialized people and we kind of carry heavy stories, so we kind of need some joy first before we go into the deepness. So so I just kind of would love that we start dismantling this. It's so funny because I sometimes walk into some spaces, rehearsal spaces, as a dancer, and I say, can I just have like 20 minutes to just gossip? And I think people think I'm nuts, but I'm like, no, seriously, I really just want to have 20 minutes to just chill before my body's fully like, but anyways, maybe people will call that being a shit disturber, but for me, it's like, no, I'm just taking care of myself and also taking care of each other, and really creating a culture where we're grounded, we're breathing together, and we're joyous together. And that, just like bringing a little bit of salt and pepper. That's it, yeah.
Well, I think what you're bringing up, though, is what is the work? What is the work? Like, is it only work if we have something like that we can show? Like, if we have a product at the end of it, is it work when there's a product? Is it work when we get something done? I mean, this is definitely something I've been looking in the mirror a lot about as someone who, comes from a entrepreneurial, like German farming family. Like the hard work entrepreneurial spirit is alive and well in me for sure. But, you know, at what cost, right? Like when you bring that intention into a world that is really thrilled to exploit your labor, well, it will. And who's taking care of you then, right? And I see this as a condition in our system of cultural production that's quite pervasive, actually, and that this question of what do artists really need in order to access imagination and to, you know, have the time to be in these practices, and what are these practices when they're not producing, like there's all these other dimensions to the I mean, artists call their work practice because that's what it is, right? It's something that we do again and again and again, and evolves, and things emerge from that. I just want to touch on for a moment this question of the social justice moment that we're in. Like it's such a big thing, and I'm trying in the essay to get at what's underneath it, because I'm feeling like a lot of the ways we're trying to address this condition of inequity is like, it's very well intentioned, but it feels like scaffolding. It doesn't feel like it's really getting at the heart. And my proposal is that maybe artists are actually chipping more at the foundation, because we're working with practices of culture, right? Those kinds of rituals and behaviors, like trying to divest ourselves of this imperative of production, and trying to like do the 20 minutes of gossip, and understand that that is part of the work that is meaningful, and that is what it is. And I'm just curious if for any of you, anyone can jump in, but are there new practices or rituals or things that you're actively experimenting with right now that are consciously trying to chip at this layer of culture change in relationship to social justice?
I don't want to take up too much space, but I mean, social justice is literally what I do. You know, in addition to writing these books that I'm now creating, I've also been working on creating a business called Voice Share that is focused on, you know, teaching people about effective communication and attitudes of inclusion that are going to lead to community leadership and social change. So that's literally what my business is focused on. And, you know, providing coaching and speaking and, you know, and gathering with folks and having them go through that kind of stuff. So I mean, but I came to that wasn't what the business was supposed to be about. Like I started the business in late 2018, and it was really just supposed to focus on helping people to be able to communicate, period. That was the whole focus. I'm a poet, I'm a spoken word artist. I figured I should create a business where I get to do what I love. And that was it, helping people communicate. Then George Floyd got murdered, and the whole world changed. The whole world changed, especially for me as a Black man. When I looked at that, and I looked at that man, and I'm saying, he's from my age category. I can identify with him very closely. You know, he's got this beautiful little girl that he's now left behind. You know, I have daughters. I look at him, and I'm thinking, that could have been my neck under that knee on that pavement in any town world. And then it was like, well, Voice Share has to be about helping people to figure out how to deal with that, as well as just simply being able to speak, but to speak to that, speak to power, speak to oppression, speak to the stuff that is shaking the foundation of the world as we know it. You know, because we had a situation where we had white folks sitting around in front of their television sets going, oh crap, racism's real. Look at this guy in this video that I'm watching, and he's literally getting the life snuffed out of him over a 9-minute period. And I can't turn away because I don't have a job to go back to or some soccer game to take my kids to because COVID has shut down the world. Holy crap. Now I'm forced to look at it. Forced to look at it. And until that moment came, folks of color trying to make this happen in the arts or otherwise, speaking to a blank wall. Can't see it, can't feel it, can't hear it, can't touch it, nothing. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So then the world becomes about How do we as artists, how do we as people, how do we as freaking human beings decide that we're going to go back to normal, whatever the hell that means? Or do we actually engage in the hard work of creating the new world that must come from those ashes? What kind of phoenix is going to raise from that? And what are we going to do with that phoenix? Are we going to try to shove it back into the cage? Or are we going to let it flow? We're going to let it fly. We're going to let it light up the world again in a different way. What does that look like? That's what I'm passionate about right now.
Yeah, and I think this is really this is what I'm interested in, because I fear that we're engaged in an exercise as a cultural sector that, again, is well-intentioned, but it's working first at this layer of policy, identity representation, and resource distribution. And I really feel like, these are part of, but they're not at the heart of the thing, right? I mean, you can have anti-racism policies, and you can even do the work of training and making sure folks are aware of what those policies are, but you still are creating those policies inside structures that have been designed for and are organized around principles of creating hierarchies among human beings. It's trying to, I guess what I'm grappling with, and I try to articulate in the essay, is that can organizations even really lead this work? Are organizational structures part of the challenge? Because they are sort of beholden to the dynamics that made them to begin with, right? So, and this is where my curiosity comes from. Do artists, if artists weren't in such precarious situations, would we be able to work more actively and intentionally at this layer of culture change and really experiment with these processes? I mean, through the pandemic, I am part of a collective, the Wind in the Leaves collective, that through the pandemic, we met once a week on Zoom just to see how everyone was doing. And that was the only intention of our connection. And we met, after George Floyd was murdered, and there are many Black folks in the collective. And it was meaningful to be in that conversation in that moment as a white person also, and to understand this active engagement with relationship across difference, I think, is one of the key things that we need to work on. And so, sorry, I'll pass it over. If others want to speak to this, how do we actually cultivate this? What are some of the practices that help cultivate this culture shift?
I'll speak to that a bit. I think one of them is getting out of this very sort of, shall I say, patriarchal, capitalistic attitude of work, and production. And we live in a society that is driven by money, that is driven by capitalism, that is driven by meritocracy, and production. And how do you break that down? But and that is why we are missing out on self-care. That's why people are turning blind eyes to things, because they're so singularly focused. So it's almost like we need to, and I think you mentioned it in your essay, Shannon, it might take generations. And I think that it is going to take generations, because it has to come at the beginning. It has to come in with our youth, and how our youth are developing and how they're shifting. And I mentor a lot of young people, and I'm seeing a huge shift in them. Unfortunately, we still have these giant structures, but I think the more that we can encourage our youth to not be satisfied with these structures, to work in different ways, and to tell our stories. I think ultimately, as artists, we are storytellers. And in the past, there have been a lot of stories that have been forbidden from being told, or that people have not been able to see, or people have refused to see, as you were saying. And now what I'm seeing more and more are young people, and it takes people who are teaching them, and I'm learning as I go a lot. I'm learning as much as they are when I'm mentoring them and listening to them, is that they want to be heard. And I think the first step is allowing each person to be heard. And that goes back to what Wind in the Leaves is doing, is having each person as an individual be able to come into the room and be honest and proud about who they are and what they have and need to say, and that needs to be respected. And so cultivating this as we're educating our artists, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this to the systems that exist, quite honestly. But I do know that I've seen so many young artists who are passionate about dismantling these systems, about listening to each other, about creating pluralistic environments, about working in a non-hierarchical way. One of the things that I've noticed, and I don't know if this could even be done in workplace environments, but this notion of we have community agreements now with students and young actors working together. And I've now seen it start to happen in rooms, in artistic rooms, where the artists will sit down and make a community agreement about what do we need in the space? What do we need to create a safe space? Can organizations be encouraged to do that as well? Can we encourage these organizations that even though we know we're not going to be able to dismantle this entire structure in a matter of a few months, a few years, God knows, hopefully a few decades, but can we start to then start to chip away at it in different ways and demand these things like community agreements, that people are allowed to be heard, that people are invited to be heard. I'm sorry, I'm going to take that back. I'm not going to say allowed, because that is a dirty word, quite honestly, not allowed. People should be invited, and it should be a communal conversation and not something that's just trickling down. You do this, you don't say this, you behave like this. Anyway, I'm on a tangent, but I think there's something in there somewhere.
Yeah, I agree about dismantling the hierarchy and this whole dismantling and the whole seniority system, because, you know, everybody at some point says, well, I experienced this also in, you know, in the 80s or in the 90s and 70s and or whatever. And I'm like, great, I don't want to experience that. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, you know, and I'm 36 years old and I work with youth a lot, and I work with children, and I also work with elders, which is incredible as well. And so one of the main things that I always talk about with the youth that I work with is really honor your uniqueness. Like it's starting from the very beginning of allowing them to access their stories, their nuances, their quirks, to be part of their artistry. Because you know I'm like, I'm not interested in my classroom anyways, where in the space that I'm holding, I'm not interested in you trying to get right, or, you know, to like get those check marks of, am I doing this right, no, I just want you to play. We're being, you know, being an artist about play. So be your own unique self. Share your stories shamelessly share your stories, especially when you're a racialized body. Share your story. And so these are the things that for me, I feel like are part of, I mean, I go back and we've you know, the work has been happening from way before, and we have a lot to learn from Caribbean and Latin American art makers, because they've been doing a lot of work in the Americas for a very long time in situations that have been very precarious. When we are experiencing violence, gang war, missing and displacement, missing people, and, you know, a lot of the art that's being created is coming from these narratives, and youth and children are being exposed to this. So they're learning from a very young age, this is what my community is experiencing, and these are the ways I can educate or express myself in regards to these issues. And it's been happening for a long time, and something that, with all the love that I have for, I think that in Canada sometimes we're too polite.
No, really?
Yeah, like too polite. And no, I think it takes a little bit more push and a little bit more celebrating of being, you know, saying a little bit of more F you. I'm not going to stand for that, you know, and it's hard. It's a scary thing to do. Even for myself, even though I've watched my mother say F you so many times, and I'm like, but mom, but like, can't you just at least keep one job, you know? And, but then like, I also admire that, because like, yeah, it's radical. It's very radical. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just going to prompt the audience, live and online. If you have some questions, please start to populate them in the chat. And I'm going to keep the conversation going with the panel, but I will check in on the chat if there are any particular questions that you'd like to introduce into this conversation. Because I am also aware of the time. We've got like 15 minutes left. Where did the time go? So I just want to open it. I mean, what did some of the ideas in this paper provoke for you? Like, are there things that you haven't had a chance to address yet that when you came across them, it either like sent your mind on a tangent, or you felt like you vehemently disagreed with them, or that were really resonant? Whatever it is for you, what do you want to say? Get it out. Susie's taking her mask off.
Yeah, there's so many things also to respond to that you brought up. Youth, the flow of learning, voicing, messaging. So just thank you for everything. The one thing that I felt compelled to touch on was this idea of process and the how we do things, and possibly the idea that we might entertain, or that artists have the ability to entertain the idea that the world making is. So that we are not necessarily world making towards a new world, but the world making is. The rebuilding of the system is. So you've touched, I mean, it was inspired by your writing. So the being, the doing. Yeah, you know, I feel like if we can't entertain that idea at the least, then we're limited possibly by content, by product. And I'm curious about what the limitations of that are, and how possibly process is more sustainable. I'll just maybe open the floor with that. I'm sure I had more on that, but I'll just let that hang.
I just want to add in also that process can be diverse. Like, I'll just use an example. Like, I'm currently in the reclaiming of my indigenous ancestry in Central America, learning now what, as part of, you know, reclaiming and part of my my process, my creative process, and like sitting in a virtual room, seeing other people that look like me in El Salvador, and we're all in that movement together. Me coming as an artist with an artistic perspective, others coming, you know, as activists, others coming as students, others coming as like, I just really want us to, you know, reclaim our indigeneity in our country. And I'm like, wow. And that's a process, you know, but it has like, we don't see it as that just yet in some spaces, right?
Yeah, just maybe just to throw another bit of an angle on the process aspect. I mean, you start off early on talking about, you know, comfort, distraction, and entertainment. You know, that's really what the purpose is, and we need to shift that, and that comfort, distraction, and entertainment is happening within you know, a framework that centralizes you know, the European experience and the paradigms around you know, making European folks comfortable with these traditions and whatnot. And so what I'm hoping for is more of what you're talking about, Irma, which is saying, okay, folks can all get together. We can talk about making people uncomfortable, right? And causing them to focus on things that are for our edification and not just for our entertainment. And that can happen in a multiplicity of ways, honoring all kinds of different backgrounds and methods of being and knowing and pursuing, you know, the attainment of this edification. And that it should be done with a mind of breaking down the centralization of those European influences and causing it to become more of a stew. And my stew needs some Scotch bonnet pepper in it. My stew needs some Irish potatoes in it, you know? My stew needs some cassava, it needs some, you know, it needs some rice, it needs all of these things. You need to bring everything, I'll bring all of those flavors together, put it in my stew. Because I feel like Canada is one of those rare places where we can all nourish each other that way if we dedicate ourselves to the process of creating that kind of a stew.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that. And I think it's also about whoever said that art needed to be a product. Really. I mean, artists create art because they have this drive, this need to create art. And so can we not start to look at art as process versus product? And I think that that's something that we really need to fundamentally look at. And as you talk about the stew, is that half the fun is making the stew and who's coming to the party and who's bringing the ingredients and who's got what to offer. And it's like, oh, you have that. Oh, I love that. Oh, interesting. I've never seen that. Well, what about this? Like, that is so exciting. And that's what's so exciting about working with artists in a pluralistic context, is that everyone has something beautiful and extraordinary to bring to the table. And can we not start to look at art more as process? And this will lead me to my next little advocacy for that, is that can we not now appeal to the different bodies or whatever to support process more than product? You know, because as you know, as we talked about, as Irma was saying, is that we have such a small amount of money and a small amount of time to create, and you know, we don't have, so as a result, we're slacking on what we should be doing, which is creating community, which is creating those conversations, which is listening and checking in to see how people are. We're having to cut those short because time is money, and we have so little time and so little money to pay people, so that we're focusing on the product. And the product is never going to be as good as when you focus on the process. Because in the process, it's like anything. It's like making a stew. You make it with love, you make it with joy, with tears, with stories. And it tastes so much better when everybody puts something in it, and when you can enjoy that process, than if you're like, I got to eat this in 10 minutes because I'm so busy and I'm burnt out, and let's just microwave something. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a big difference from just putting that thing in the microwave oven and getting it done and putting it out there than it is to just actually create this process. And I think that's what we're missing. And that's what we need to go back to, is to start to let go of this horrible structure that we're in and that's constraining so many of us, and enjoy the process of art making, and finding ways in which we can support that financially as well.
And sharing it publicly.
Yes, sharing the process.
Sharing the process publicly.
Yeah. There's been so much conversation around this idea of innovation right now, and it's something that I try to make a statement about in the paper, but I also want to say that, you know, innovation, we are in a way constrained by the idea of innovation because of how we think about it, right? And for some reason, how we think about it doesn't seem to include processes of artistic creation inside that idea. So, you know, in the essay, I make a distinction that artistic process is more like invention in terms of how we're conceiving of it. But essentially right now, like Canada is saying, innovate, innovate, innovate. System of cultural production is saying that too. We need to innovate. We need to innovate. Well, what is that? Like, how do we do that, actually? Like, how do we do that without reifying the stuff that we have, without just working at the level of incremental change? And do you see the value of investment in artistic process as a lever for change, actually? A lever for change that is going to act on the same kind of proposal that all this innovation funding is attempting to address, which is about decolonization, which is even about things like new business models, what we do in the digital era, about, you know, social and environmental justice. Like, why is it such a divide that artistic process is not a place we want to invest in order to address those things, but innovation seems to be the lens for that? I don't quite understand, but I'm curious what your thoughts.
Can I say something small? I just feel like when I was reading the essay, like, I've heard this word innovation, even like when I was sitting at the Center for Spanish Speaking People's board of directors, and I kept on being like, I don't get it. Like, and I just feel that it's a consistent erasure still of Indigenous and Black narratives, that we're like, innovate what? Like, I just feel like it perpetuates erasure. The whole construct perpetuates erasure, and it doesn't sit well with me, especially like after reading this. I was like, yeah, I'm like, I still sit here. This doesn't resonate with me. So I don't know. Yeah, if anybody wants to.
I think maybe it's because the innovation is happening, as you're saying, Shannon, that the innovation is happening with the stuff we already got, right? So we've taken the stuff that we've already got and we're saying, ooh, this is cool. So the 8 is over here and the 3 is over here. Let's put the 3 over here and then the 8 over here. And now we've got something innovative because nobody's seen us do this before. But it's like, but if you're innovating with that, where are the indigenous voices that have already been outside of that? Where are the Black voices that are already outside that? Where are the LGBTQ plus voices that are already outside of that? Where are the differently abled voices that are outside of that, et cetera, et cetera? And so, yeah, so we're taking the sheet of paper, and instead of making an airplane out of it, we're making a fake snowball and we're throwing it at somebody's head. Woo, innovation. But maybe what we could do is take the sheet of paper, take it somewhere else, and do something completely different. Whoa, do something completely different. Create with it instead of debate what it looks like, and it's in a different shape. Like I think that's what you're getting at, and I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah.
I'll bite.
Go ahead.
Yay.
It makes me think about this idea. There's a cultural theorist, Sarah Ahmed, who speaks to wonder, and the idea that wonder is looking at the world as if for the first time. But it presupposes, or it hangs out with the idea that we're not in that new world. And so to engage with wonder is to engage with this like radical redefining of the relationship with the past. And so I'm hearing what you're saying about, it's not layering this new idea on top of what was and going, well, it's done. We don't attend to the other stuff anymore. But engaging with that, reworking, moving away, it's just affirming what you're saying. And I feel like wonder, as artists, we engage with wonder. We engage with this like, what if for the first time?
Well, and I also see a fair divide happening between sort of like the world of the artists, our processes, the things that happen in the studio, the things that happen like in the process of creation, and then this other process that's happening, which is somehow the kind of evolution of the system of cultural production, the evolution of cultural policy. I mean, I feel like, I am an artist who attempts to bridge this gap a little bit. And I think, Greg, you are too. Someone who engages in policy spaces. I haven't been as active as of late in my career because, again, it starts to consume you and there's no time for the art. But I am sort of disheartened by this gap. I mean, all of this panel has so much to say, but I'm curious, like Irma or Anita or Susie, have you been ever engaged in conversations around public policy before, like actively sought out in conversations of public policy, and how these ideas can actually take hold inside those conversations?
Yeah, recently I was working at Working Women as a community engagement coordinator for the Parent Ambassador Program, which is basically for immigrant, newcomer parents and caregivers. And it was about navigating the education system, the very racist and oppressive education system. And maybe we weren't working on policy, but we were working on how to advocate in spaces. We were trying to be part of the conversation with the parents and just teaching them how this very racist Canadian system works and how it's designed to keep Indigenous and Black kids in a very criminalized position, because the experience of Black boys in schools is sickening. And it's things that I went to Oakwood. It's a very racialized school. You know what I mean? Like, and I remember the times when there was police walking around the school. In that time, I guess it was normal for us to see that. But then when I'm here in this position, working with these parents and having these conversations and talking about how they can bring up these issues in the school boards and in the meetings, I felt very sick of knowing, wow, like this has been happening for a very long time. And I'm learning about this at this age, that this was like we were in a very oppressive situation by experiencing that as youth, And but anyways, I went on a tangent. But so I recently was working with Working Women on just empowering parents to feel to have the knowledge they need in order to advocate for their children in the school system. Yeah.
I have not worked at the policy level, I will say. I've spoken, I've done a lot of activism, but not on the policy level. No.
And Susie, I feel like you're starting more actually to work at this level.
Late bloomer. But, it never seemed to me, I'm thinking back, how did I perceive policy and my relationship to it, over the years? Like, just a non-relationship, because I don't think we're asked. We're not invited to do the thought residency, which we should. Like, just let's have more thought residencies that artists populate. So yeah, it's only recently. So now, I'm just cutting my teeth on what it means to be a part of an initiative towards, better spaces, safer spaces. And just to make a quick attribution, the WISE practices that I mentioned earlier, it was brought to my mind by Jessa Aguilo at Arts Pond, who are doing some really interesting work around the caring sector, just to throw that in there.
I love that. Thought residencies with artists. That's a great idea. That's a great idea. I would love to see, I've often thought that inviting artists into other sectors of society with all of our processes of creation is actually one of the ways that artists' value can become more visible, like the value of our processes, not just the value of our content, right? And I think, that distinction was well brought up, Susie, like that why are artists being reduced to the value of our content? And I do think it's because of the society that we live in. Like, even the rationale for the advocacy that we do is about driving economic development. And this narrative is one that the arts sector doesn't love. And I don't know that politicians really love it either, but it's effective because it's the language of our world. And I think this is like one of the hard things is like, how do we change that narrative? Like, what is the story that we need to tell as an art sector, and as artists, about why we have the arts in society? I mean, it is a project of human development, is it not? And is that not what it is that we need right now? Like, aren't we not in a moment of major human transformation? Like, isn't that kind of at the heart of what then the systems will later reflect? And I just feel like it's happening backwards. Yeah. So I've got a question here. Has anyone in the group identified, this is from Anne Frost, by the way, at Humber College. Has anyone in the group identified potential allies within policy funding bodies who may raise the profile of these ideas at those tables? Great question. Any allies?
Well, there's a couple places you could potentially look to that. There could be some of the folks who are working as officers at the funding councils, and knowing some of those people personally, that they're doing that work. And I don't think the public is at all aware of the heavy lifting that's being done by the granting officers inside of these organizations in order to push public policy as it relates to the arts, and to elevate the artistic community through those avenues. They're not just there to coordinate the giving out of money to artists. They're doing much more than just that. So those are some good allies. And I think we also have to think about not necessarily talking to the politicians per se, but about going into some of those bureaucratic organizations. I used to work for a decade as a federal public servant. Talk about choose your own precarity, man. Once I got in there was no art happening, but there were other things that were happening, and I'm sitting at these policy tables at these interdisciplinary and interdepartmental discussions, some of which were touching on issues of the arts. And because I was an artist and I just didn't care as a public servant and I said whatever the hell I wanted to say, because that's what artists do, I was doing a lot of FU in those circles. It's part of the reason why I can't keep a job for more than a year. But ultimately, there are people who are in those spaces as well who we can look to for allyship. And I think the final one is that we need to lean into some of the folks who are involved in government relations in the for impact sector. I never call it not-for-profit anymore. So folks who are working in the for impact sector who actually do have some work where they are interacting with government organizations and have the ability to talk about issues that are affecting the arts. Those are some other allies we should think about cultivating.
That's great. And I'm just connecting it to another question that's coming up. Can you discuss more what the involvement of non-artists would look like in process-oriented artist endeavors? So it's kind of the opposite question, like how can non-artists support or be involved in this process-oriented artists' work? Does anyone want to respond to that?
To do with this idea that sometimes, there's this myth out there that making art is this kind of exclusive kind of thing and you have to be invited to the party. And even as artists, I think we feel that sometimes, or at least I felt that, is that there are these sort of circles that you need to be invited into and it's a special ticket that you have to have. And that happens in all of us, in theater and dance and everything. And, we've all been excluded from certain circles, and that's part of the hierarchy. And I think it is also about not excluding the community from these artistic circles and finding ways in which community members can be invited in. I have some colleagues, and I will say, unfortunately, but they are south of the border. But they're a special group who is south of the border. But I wish they were up here. And they have open rehearsals. And they will invite anyone who wants to come into the rehearsal to see what's happening. And they will have spaces where they will have an open rehearsal and say, anybody can come on in and watch our process. And people from the community can come in. And whether you want to come in just as an individual and watch the process, and forums where you can feed back on things that you can support. So there are ways, I think, that we can make our rehearsal spaces more accessible to the communities that we live and that we work in. And that will create a completely different way of working. I think it will demystify this sort of, what's this artistic process? Because as artists, we're just people too, right? And we're people who have something to say and who want to say something, and we're just trying to express ourselves. And oftentimes we're trying to express what we see in our communities and what we experience and what we witness, and we're trying to give voice to that. So I think the more that we can open up our spaces and find ways in which we can involve our communities, as whether we are doing it at grassroots level, whether we're doing it at the larger companies, there's certainly room for the larger institutions and organizations to open their doors more to communities and not make it this kind of condescending, oh, we're having a special community day. And it feels very, some of the larger companies, I will not name them, but they've kind of made these days. Well, you're invited in to meet the company. And it's a very structured kind of elitist kind of thing, as opposed to, hey, let's come on in and watch a rehearsal. Come on in and watch the company, warm up with the dance stuff. And I don't know. I think the more we can take down those closed door policies, the better.
Oh my God, I have to add something to that.
Yeah, go.
A lot of times we are, especially these many money companies, lots and lots of monies. That's taxpayer money.
Yeah.
And some tickets to even watch a produced show is unaccessible. And one of the things is art belongs to the public. We are functioning, we are working with public money. Our work should be seen by the public, whether they pay for it or not. They're already paying for it by paying tax money. You know what I mean? And so that is a huge thing for me. And I think that's something that how non-artists, I guess, could get involved in their allyship is come and make yourself seen in rehearsal spaces. Feel free to, we need to also shed that layer of I'm an artist and I need to be in my cocoon and I have to think and I have to just make sure that, okay, relax, just share your process. We are educating the public, and it's our responsibility to be part of the educational development of our society. And allies, non-artists, get in there, learn from what other artists are doing, talk about it, and actually demand it in your communities. I want these types of artists in my communities, in the parks, in the libraries, in the community centers, at schools, when schools are closed in the summer. Maybe I want, this particular group of collective to take up the space in the gym because, I feel like all these kids can learn something from what this particular group is doing in their creative process. And it will inspire new generations of artists, I think.
Yeah.
That's my humble opinion.
Thank you. I want to give each panelist a last thought moment. And while you're thinking about that, Irma, I just wanted to say that, this is also one of the proposals that I'm interested in is how do artists share that among each other? Because I feel like actually we're not doing that well enough as a community of artists, let alone in the wider world. And I think there's actually tons of gold in these processes that will come forward and that we need to have a way to socialize our experience and process a bit more with each other, that more active engagement across our differences. And I feel like, especially when you think about the public funding model in Canada being peer driven, and we don't really do this. So we're assessing each other's work without a really fulsome kind of culture of engagement in each other's processes. It feels very siloed. And, that siloing is very much a mirror of how the system is designed. So it's, if we can see that and start to work differently, I think that will potentially have an impact just on the continued work of engagement across difference and the continued commitment to seeing, to becoming aware, the awareness that we need that always precedes any form of change. So with that last thought, can I start with you, Greg?
Sure, I guess so.
I'm going to go down the line, heads up.
Right. So I think ultimately, it's the image of the crossroads, right? We're at a crossroads. We can do what Shannon is suggesting and try to do something that's really creative as opposed to recreative, right? Or we can go back to the future or future to the back or do what we thought we got rid of and think we could do that better, But that's Einstein insanity, folks. We can't keep doing that same thing and expect a different result. We're just going to keep recreating the garbage that we've had before, where people are feeling excluded, where people are not being given that opportunity to be what I like to think of as being comfortably uncomfortable. We need to be able to shift our mindset to allow for ourselves to sit in our discomforts, to analyze things in a different way, to think about what the world could be like if we made the hard decisions that we shy away from day to day, and think about how we could get there. And that is a truly creative process. That is a process that can be led by artists like the ones who are sitting on my left and the one on my right. And those of you who are at home watching, this moment is about what we can do. Shedding that BS, oh my God, I'm an artist and I just gotta do my things, so just give me some space. Shed that crap. Bring other folks in, other perspectives, ally with folks who are gonna help you to make changes in public policy, in terms of political engagement and in terms of that process making, so that ultimately the meanings that we make are different than the meanings that we've made before. And that is how we recreate this new paradigm you're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Making meaning. I was just thinking, it was inspired by Anita talking about spaces. I was just thinking about today, what happened today that is already working what we're talking about. And when I walked into the building here to come to the Aki studio, there was life going on. There was a group of youth right inside the door, someone else hanging out. There was this intersection that made me feel like humanity was at work in the building, and what a way to enter. So that at work, and then to come into this space and be offered the opportunity to meet us through our art, and then just be asked what we think. It's pretty simple, but I just want to, these things are at work. So I do feel the hope around that. I feel the hope, for folks who are attending today, and the dialogue that we've been able to have relationally, which is also what we've been talking about. So there are nuggets of doable things that are already in motion. Just want to ride that wave.
Yeah. Thank you, Susie.
Yeah. I think that something that I will take away from this, and that I will think that I'm also, this is for myself as well, is to work from a place of greater support, as opposed to individuality. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we mobilize as artists and really start to work together in a more supportive way, in a more collective way, in a more invitational way, where we're not blocking each other, where we're not blocking others, I think that we can become a much stronger force as an artistic voice. And that will give us so much more momentum in trying to break down the doors that we're trying to break down and the structures that we're trying to break down. But I think it has to start with us, with our own generosity. Mm-hmm. And how can I act in a more generous way? Because let's face it, as independent artists, we are clamoring for those funds, for that money, and it becomes a competitive, as Shannon says, battleground. Mm-hmm. And at times I feel a bit ashamed as to how I gotta get that, I gotta do better. And I feel like I'm so driven because I gotta get that money so I can pay my people, and everybody else is feeling that way. And how can we, yes, still be driven to get those funds that we need, but how can we not neglect our fellow artists and our people in our community in order to try to while we're in this battleground? And I don't know how we're going to do it, but I think that if we can all stop and breathe and have the conversations, listen to each other and hear what's being said and invite the stories in, then I think that we can be more creative and find more creative ways together as an artistic community, regardless of our discipline, to brainstorm. Because the more elements in your stew, Greg, the better, right? Mm-hmm. And the more complex and nuanced and the more ideas it will generate. So that's all I'm going to say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anita.
I guess I'll just say something small, because I think that a lot of the things that you've all said resonate with me, and something that sticks with me is that we deserve to also rest. Mm-hmm. We deserve to have whatever our Sunday, quote unquote, whatever that means, our Sunday, because in order to mobilize, we need to do it well replenished, and we need to make sure that there's food on the table, and that we need to make sure that we are seeing those people that nourish us in a spiritual level and in an emotional level, in order to be full and fully committed in the movement of change. If we are burnt out, it's going to be perpetual, mm-hmm. and we will never be able to actually advance. We're just kind of constantly being run over, mm-hmm. and weekend, I guess. And so I think that's essential. Number one is rest, and number one is the fortification of yourself in order to be strong with your community. And that we deserve to grow. We deserve it. It's our right to grow, to develop, to be curious, and to protest. It is our right.
Thank you all. Wow, you're all just so brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughtful remarks, Irma, Anita, Susie, and Greg. Truly. And to those of you out there in the Zoom room, thank you for staying with us. I know this has been a long and rich discussion, many, many thoughts, and I hope that this is just the beginning of more discussions among artists and between artists and the system of cultural production. Artists, we need to organize and we need help. And so thank you. Thank you also to Sapamo, to Kevin and Charles, and to the tech team. Oh my goodness, I know this is one big hybrid world experiment. Thank you so much. so much. And for those of you online, for your patience as we work through this. It's really tremendous, the energy that's come together to make this happen.